Hello everyone, my name is Jim Kibler, and the purpose of our video today is to introduce our new kit offering. This is a smoothbore gun, commonly known as an English Fowler or English Fowling Piece. We just started selling this about 3 or 4 days ago. It's the end of May 2024. We just wanted to talk a little bit about the gun itself and the historical significance of these guns. So this gun is based on smoothbore guns that were made in England during the 1760s and 1770s for the intent of export to the colonies or early America, depending on the time frame. In England during that time period, various grades of guns were made. Very low quality guns that were intended to be traded with the Indians, to very, very high-end deluxe guns. Guns of every quality in between were also produced. It's important to put this in the context of what it is, because there are differences in styling of all those particular guns. I think that most people that shoot black powder have a general vague idea of what an English Fowler or fowling piece is, but haven't really drilled down to the different quality levels and the different styling details. And many people don't study originals very much. They often just look at what's available today in terms of kits or what people have produced. And some things they might see on this gun look a little bit different than what they're accustomed to. There is historical basis for all of this, and we're proud that we produced a kit that's very historically correct to the smallest detail. So a good place to start would be what's commonly referred to as the Bumford trade gun. So it's pictured, it belongs to Colonial Williamsburg.
A lot of pretty guns in there.
Okay, so this is what's referred to as the Bumford trade gun, because it is signed by Bumford on the lock plate. I believe it's John Bumford. And it says that he worked in 1750, 1760 time frame. So this would be an example of one of the lowest quality guns that would have been produced in England at the time. Now that's not a judgment on the gun, it's a fantastic gun, but there were just different quality levels that were produced. One thing I'll also mention is that it seems in the second half of the 18th century, gun making really exploded in England, and there were a lot more guns produced and a lot more grades produced. Some details about the Bumford trade gun and what makes it unique, or that particular style or class of gun unique, is many things. Some is you can see the architecture, you can start there. It's pretty dramatic, very pinched down wrist. It has sheet metal hardware, so the hardware isn't cast. It's just made of sheet metal and bent to fit the stock. You can see the guard is a good example of that. Same thing with the butt plate. So this would have been made to trade with the Indians primarily. So another example of the quality level of the gun is the lock itself. So if we look at it closely, we can see there's not a bridle on the frizzen. And some people think that that's a dating feature, but it really isn't. It's just an indicator of the quality level of the gun, or the expense or the cost of the gun, I guess I should say. And this lock probably doesn't have an internal bridle either. And the barrel is what's known as a 3-stage barrel. You can see how it has a round forward section, an intermediate round section of larger diameter, followed by an octagon breech. This is a very old barrel form that probably started in the 1660s or 50s. Continued in use in England probably until the very early 18th century, but then it started fading away on high quality guns. But it's interesting that on these trade guns, these earlier design details were continued.
So I know that the sheet metal was cheaper and some of these other things were cheaper. Mm-hmm. Was that actually easier for them to make, or was that just a style choice?
It was just a style, and I think it was just, if anything, it was just perhaps a little more labor, but not that much. Labor was pretty cheap at the time. Just a carryover and stylistic detail. Another example are these ramrod pipes. You can see just a little bit. They've got lots of rings around them, and that's to imitate the bulbous ramrod pipes that are seen on 17th century guns. We'll show more examples of those here in a little bit.
If those were made out of sheet, how did they get the...
Sometimes they would form the bulbous shapes in the sheet for rolling it and forming it into the pipe. These may have had that done to them. They may have just been filed in a little bit too. I'm not quite sure. You can see it has a serpentine side plate. That's another, well, we have a close-up of the pipes here. So actually these pipes look like they were just filed in. To me, they might have been rolled because it's so thin. It's hard to know for sure. But I guess the point is that they're a simulation of the proper bulbous pipe. You can see it has a serpentine side plate. Again, it's just sheet metal. It is engraved. The serpentine side plate, again, is something that started being used in probably 1650s in France, and it's still hanging on a century later in England on these trade guns or lower grade guns.
So it looks it's painted on.
It is. That's one thing I failed to mention, that it does have some floral decoration that's painted on the stock. Again, these were intended for the natives, and they probably found that very appealing. They could, they had more value when they added that. It's really a pretty spectacular gun. In the scheme of things, a very early Indian trade gun that's in really great condition. There are probably many of these, but they, were made quickly. They probably didn't last very long at all. Okay. So the next gun that we'll talk about as an example, and we'll show some pictures of it, is a gun made by John Harmon. This may not be, or it isn't the highest of grade, but it's still a very high quality gun that was intended for use in England by the people of means. So some of the differences in the highest of end guns from the same time period. The first thing is the barrel shape. They wouldn't have the three-stage barrel. They would usually have either what's called a Spanish form barrel, where you had a round forward section transitioning to an octagon rear section. So they might have that style, or probably more likely, they would have just a round barrel that transitions into a little more of an octagon shape. And we'll show some examples of that on some original guns that we have here. The biggest difference is the size of the breech. So on high-grade guns, the breech would be 1 3/8 inches, maybe even 1.5 inches. On these lower-grade guns, maybe 1.16 inches or something like that. So huge difference in breech size, which in turn affects the shape of the gun and the architecture. Another one would be something called a standing breech. So a standing breech, bit of the breech that stays in the tang, that stays in the stock, and then the barrel has a hook on it so you can tip the barrel out. So the breech stays in the gun. It makes it so you can remove the barrel very easily. High-end guns will have that.
Only in high-end, lower end won't.
So some lower end would, but not. But you will never see a fixed breech in a high-end gun. Okay? You'd never see a fixed breech in a high-end English gun. But you may sometimes see the tip-out breech in slightly lower grade guns. Okay. And we'll show some examples of those too. And along with that, when using the standing breech, they would usually have keys rather than pins. And those keys could be slid out very easily, and the barrel can be removed very easily. So those are a couple details there. Let's keep on going here. The locks would be much higher quality, where they would have things like the pans would be bridled, so the frisons would have bridles on them. They'd have a bridle inside the lock or on the tumbler. Just 2-bolt locks, no 3-bolt locks. Sometimes they would add rollers to the frizzen, or rollers even to the mainspring, or later links. So the locks were just in general much higher quality. The mounts were cast or chiseled. So the highest grade guns were chiseled iron or steel. One step down would have been cast silver. And you'd think that silver would be more expensive, but it's just the difficulty of chiseling the iron or the steel is made the cost greater than the cast silver hardware. So this Harmon gun has cast silver hardware, but it's designed very nice, very ornate. Oftentimes these guns had wire inlay in addition to the relief moldings, perhaps even wire inlay in addition to relief carving around the tang. More detailed engraving. Some of them had just fantastic, beautiful engraving, while some of these lower grade guns still had engraving, but they, is much more quickly accomplished, and not as detailed.
Were they made by different methods? Like for the lower end, with the factories that made them, or the groups look?
So it's a good question. That there were different categories of guns, and then there are classes of guns, and there were different classes of people that made them to some degree as well. There may have been a gunsmith and his team or his people that made a little bit of a range of guns, but maybe not from the highest quality to the lowest quality. There's some overlap, but I don't think they usually stretch themselves to that degree. And the best guns were built in London, and those people were part of the Gunmakers Guild, and the best didn't necessarily work on the low-grade guns.
Mm-hmm. So it might have been an opportunity, the trade to the United States might have been an opportunity for some of these other lower-grade gunsmiths to be able to get business.
Not only the gunsmiths, but also merchants that were doing the trading, and they were setting up the deals, and it was a whole system. And the reason why these came into the States or the colonies, they were cheaper. They could produce them much cheaper in England than they could be produced in the colonies, early America. They were available at general stores and available to the public here. There were some that were intended for trade with the Indians, and there were some that were just intended for general consumption for whoever wanted to buy them at general stores. And oftentimes those were white people, of moderate means, and it was a gun that they could use.
Were they cheaper over there just because they already had the infrastructure set up?
Yeah, so they had systems in place where a lot of people, a lot of specialization would work on these guns. Not one gunsmith would put a gun together. There were, there might have been a dozen different people that specialized in different aspects of the gun building. Sometimes a cottage industry where there were different shops set up, and they could make them, fast and cheap that way.
Do you know when it became more expensive for them to import them than when did it get set up in the United States for them to start making, or when did these become less popular?
Well, they were making trade guns or export grade guns even into trade guns late into the 19th century, believe it or not. They're like more Pacific Northwest style guns. Rifles became very popular in this country, so there was definitely a rifle culture in this country. And that's something that isn't present in England, a strong rifle culture. Post-Rev War, gunsmithing sort of exploded in this country, and I think it's pretty safe to say that there are a lot more guns being produced here, and a lot more being consumed here, and less imports. So we talked about sort of the lowest end guns, and we talked about some of the highest end guns, and then there were grades in between as well. And that's where our kit falls. So it would be a step up from this Bumford trade gun that we talked about. There's some details that kind of put it in that class. An example of our kit that we put together, it's stocked in maple, which isn't necessarily the appropriate wood for the gun, but this happens to be the first stock I got off the machine that was usable, so I just went ahead and finished it as a gun. Some of the details that put it in the class or style that it is. So the first is the barrel. It still has what's called the three-stage barrel. So round section, shorter round section, octagon section. So 3 stages. This is all one barrel. This isn't joined or anything like that. All one barrel. And again, this is a style that was present in France in 1660s or 50s, and still was popular on some of these guns, a century later in England. And by the way, England was heavily influenced by the French gunsmiths. So the barrel shape puts it in a certain class with the size of the breech. So the breech is about 1 1/8 inches. Now, higher grade guns would have a bigger breech. Another example that separates it is the breech plug. So this is a fixed breech plug. So it's not a tip-out barrel. The breech plug doesn't stay in the stock. It doesn't have a standing breech. The barrel doesn't tip out. It's all fixed. So that would be a little push it down in the grade a little bit. It doesn't have keys. It just has pins that hold the barrel to the stock. So the ramrod pipes on this are fairly typical. They're representative of just sheet metal ramrod pipes. A cast tab, which is how these originals were made. So the tab on the entry pipe was cast, and they would roll sheet. And in our case, these round pipes are machined, but they're very representative of sheet metal pipes. Now, they don't have the bulbous shape, but it wouldn't be a surprise if you saw this particular gun with some of those bulbous details on the ramrod pipes. It has a proper English guard on it that you'd expect even on some of the higher grade guns, although a relatively restrained finial, not anything too crazy. Very typical English trigger. Lock is a little higher quality in that it has a bridle for the pan. Inside it has a bridle as well. The shaping and styling is fairly refined, maybe not as high-end as the deluxe guns, but still pretty refined and, fairly representative of classic English styling. This one has a little bit more sweep to the toe line, and there were some English guns that had a little more French influence and that exhibited this this architecture that just has a tiny bit of that French feel. The carving on this gun is relatively restrained. You'd see much more complex examples on high-grade guns and lower-grade guns that'd be even simpler than this. This one here, I added some chip cuts up in here that probably won't be part of the kit. I wasn't real pleased with that, but some of these other chip cuts will be there. That's most of the details. No wire inlay on the gun. The engraving would be pretty quick. It wouldn't be that detailed. Pretty standard basic side plate. The higher grade guns would have very ornate relief side plates, or just pierced side plates, or heavily engraved side plates. This one doesn't have a serpent on it. Some of the lower grade guns tended to have that serpent side plate.
Mm-hmm. And with the trigger guard and butt plate would have been cast
yes,
at that time
definitely.
too.
This has cast hardware, so these guns could have been made at the same time, just different quality levels. That this gun has cast hardware rather than sheet metal hardware, as the Bumford example has.
And they're always single triggers with fowling pieces.
Yeah, so fowling pieces always had single triggers. The trigger was made to be pulled rather than squeezed very carefully for sighting or shooting. When these guns were developed with shooting shot in mind, but when they're exported over here, you can be sure that round balls were shot all the time, and anything else they could shove down the barrel at times, especially the Indians, in order to kill something. So they'd shoot about anything. They'd probably rocks and probably metal and what else? Who knows? I'm sure they did. When you were very desperate, you would shoot whatever you could. And lead wasn't always something that people had. There's one example I remember hearing about where they found a buried trade gun, or a sunken trade gun or something, I don't know. But anyway, it was still loaded, and they pulled the load, and it had a projectile that was sort of like an ellipse or an elongated slug. So it started out as a round ball, and they smashed it out or chewed it out or something to make it fit the bore. So they elongated it and then shoved it down the bore. So.
What about the other stuff you have back there?
Okay, so we're going to show some examples of original guns to put this in a little better context. So this is a gun that was made in England by John Shaw. It's much more of a deluxe gun, though certainly not the highest of grade, but still very nicely made by one of the best builders in England at the time. This is a gun, a wild fowling gun. It was made. It's a large gun. It was made to shoot, floating waterfowl was probably what its intended usage was. But there are some of those details that are kind of neat to see and talk about the carryover. And one, of course, is the bulbous ramrod pipes. So that's a very early detail from, this is probably a gun from 1700, and it carries them on the deluxe guns. But then they threw out that design probably within 10 years of this gun's, 10, maybe 20 years of this gun's production. But it is a very, very nicely made gun. The side plate is here too. So it has a serpentine side plate. And this is relief. So this is steel. So that all that had to be chiseled. It wasn't cast or anything like that. So it had to all be chiseled, shaped with punches, files, scrapers, stones, loose abrasives, things of that nature. So it's very labor intensive, and it's done extraordinarily well. Just amazing skill, to be perfectly honest. So in terms of how the details of this gun that are relevant to our kit, so part of it's the kind of gun that it is, but part of it's the time period too. when it was produced. So during this time period, big, round, inflated, bulbous forms were popular. You know, you look at the carving and how high it is and how it becomes part of the architecture. And big swells at the entry pipe, and you know, it's just a different style is what it is.
What year did you
1700
say?
approximately.
1700.
Yeah. Okay, so next gun we'll look at, one that pretty heavily influenced our kit. Let's just start looking at this side here. So again, this was a gun that was made in England, probably in the 1760s, perhaps early 1770s. So our kit isn't a direct copy of this, but there are a lot of details that are very similar. So originally the wood would have gone clear to the end of the barrel, but it's broken off and it was kind of hastily repaired with homemade sheet metal pipe there. This belongs to a friend, and that's one of the things that he's appealing about the gun, if I recall, is how it was repaired. Some people would just take that sort of thing off and think it was just junk, but it's kind of part of the life of the gun. So it's stocked in walnut, in English walnut.
This is where the side plate is much more like...
So the side plate is very much like our kit side plate. The trigger guard, very similar.
Neat.
And the butt plate is very, very similar as well. And the stocking, the architecture is very similar. It has the 3-stage barrel that we talked about. Now it has a lot of wear, and the details of the 3-stage are a little less defined. It actually has a standing breech, so this is a step up from our kit in terms of original quality level, where the breech stays in the stock, and it has keys, so you'd pull the keys and you'd be able to tip out the barrel easily. Fairly simple carving like our kit offering. A little more of a floral thumb piece, but still very, very, very nice. Simple engraving on the butt plate. Cast hardware. So this has a flat face lock on it, which is a little bit later than the round face lock. And the breech on this barrel is probably a little smaller than ours. It looks to be more like about 1 1/16. Originally it would have been flintlock. It was converted to percussion at some stage. This gun probably weighs, I don't know, 6 pounds maybe. So they're very, very light guns. It has a 48-inch barrel too. So it may weigh a little bit over 6 pounds, but not much. And part of that weight savings is actual wall thickness of the barrel. So you can see how thin that barrel is. That's a characteristic of English guns. So not really anybody today makes barrels that are that thin. We're pushing them as thin as we can, or I guess I should say as thin as we feel comfortable with, considering all the different ways these could be used or misused. Our minimum barrel wall thickness is 70 to 75 thousandths in the thinnest part of the barrel. If I were just making a one-off gun, it'd probably be 50 thousandths thick or 40 thousandths thick, somewhere in that range, maybe 40. So, they're very, very thin wall barrels. We offer our kit in two gauges, 16 and 20. That's why I prefer the 16 gauge. They both have the same exterior shape of the barrel, but the bore size is different, 62 versus 67. So, there's differences in wall thickness between the two. I think the 16 gauge just handles a little nicer. It's more representative of a true English gun. You could shoot ball out of either probably, but the 20 gauge will perform better, be a little more stable, a little more accurate. The ball will be a little less heavy. You'll get a little bit better ballistics out of the 20 gauge. So that's what you should do if you intend to shoot ball, although these aren't really designed for that. So let's move on to some more guns to look at. Okay, so this is another example of a gun of probably a relatively similar time frame to our kit, maybe a little bit later perhaps. And there's some interesting details on it. So it has a 3-stage barrel again, so round forward section, intermediate round section that steps up to an octagon section. Has a fixed breech this time, no tip out breech. Has pins holding the barrel on rather than keys. Has a flat side plate.
I like
pretty
engraving.
Nice engraving, but pretty quick. Has actually a little bit of a relief cast thumb piece. Again, not highly detailed, but still nice. Some pretty nice engraving on the butt plate. Still your classic English style butt plate with round toe, step front extension. Look at some other details here. Again, rolled ramrod pipes with the cast finial. They were joined, they were silver brazed or soldered together. Yep, there you go. And the guard has the 3-petal flower, whatever you want to call it, which is slightly earlier than the acorn that's seen, that we'll show an example of. Now the architecture on this gun is a little simpler, a little less refined, kind of straight, not as appealing. So it's probably, I would guess, my guess would be a little later than what our kit represents.
Yeah, it doesn't dip down as much. It's that bottom line that you're talking about?
Yeah.
Okay.
Kind of straight. Anything else that's interesting about this? Not that I really see right this second.
Does the lock look?
So it's again, it's converted to percussion, so it would have been a flint lock, and it's a flat-faced lock. Okay, so let's look at another example here. So this is a little later gun, and one thing that tells me it's a little later is the acorn finial on the guard. I don't think they started using those until maybe the late 1770s or something. Mid-late 1770s, maybe 1780s. It's again, that's even on higher end guns. You know, the styles were started by people making these higher end guns, and they trickled down to lower grade guns. So I wouldn't think this is any earlier than 1780s. And the lock style too. It's a flat face lock, but still pretty decent quality. Again, converted percussion. So the fact that these guns that I'm showing you are all converted to percussion tells us, you know, in the style of the conversion, they've been over here for a long time, and they were used in this country. It's not something that just came over.
Was there inlay in here, or
So
is that just...
you might think that there's wire inlay put in those grooves, but I don't think there ever was. I think it was some kind of just stamps. They basically just stamped in the grooves with maybe pre-made stamps of some of these shapes, or even just gouges, because there's not really any appreciable material removed, and I don't think it had wire in it. You'd see those designs with wire in them, but I don't think so. When you look at areas that are worn, you don't see that these grooves had any depth whatsoever to them.
And it looks like the thumb piece is high.
These were not always completely sunk in the wood, and that kind of goes back to the cast relief ones, you know, were just based on the fact that they're relief, you know, they weren't necessarily flush with the wood. So it sticks up a little bit, but that not just from where it was never completely flush with the wood. This barrel, we talked a little bit about the shape of barrels you generally see on a lot of the higher end English guns, and this is an example where it's round and it kind of transitions to a bit of an octagon shape clear at the breech. Not even a full true octagon, but a rough octagon, and then it kind of morphs into the round section. Now it has a bit of a flat on the top, a very, very gentle flat. This molding is defined with engraving. On high grade guns, you'd see all those moldings be relief. Hopefully, by studying these original guns, it puts our kit in a little better context of, you know, where it falls in English gun making during the 1760s and 70s. It sometimes becomes a little frustrating because people base what they expect to see on a gun based on what they have seen. And most people, for whatever reason, don't like to study original guns. It's just a fact. And so they just think what it should be is what they've seen. And a lot of what they've seen are not very good, to be honest. I have to say the truth. And when I say not very good, it means in confirmation to original work, number one, which is very, very important to me. And, you know, also it could go into just general workmanship, craftsmanship, styling, etc. So that's a good introduction to one thing I had in my notes of what separates our kit from other people's kits, you know, or guns that you've seen. One of the important things we talked about is the barrel. A lightweight barrel, having the wall thickness as thin as we can comfortably accomplish. So that's an important detail. Having the three-stage barrel, appropriate barrel for this grade of gun. One of the big differences you see is the architecture. Well, I shouldn't say almost, I think pretty much every manufactured gun I've seen that claimed to be an English gun have huge forestalks. And they have huge forestalks because drilling ramrod holes can be tricky. To battle that, they just make the forestalk bigger so they don't have to fight ramrod holes. But that's not how these guns are. They have very slim forestocks. So if you're used to seeing big meaty forestocks, it's completely wrong. It's not right at all. The refinement of the stock shaping, it's very detailed, very close to the original work. No extra wood on it. When you get it, it's right. The including of the carving, the relief carving. Let's look at the walnut one because I think it's a little nicer. This is what you can expect with the relief carving. So no other kits have offered relief carving like this. This is the first. So you got this shell carving. It's done with CNC, cleaned up by hand. And then some of the details like the chip cuts are put in by hand. Lock moldings, all part of the carving. The lock panels are another thing that separates this gun from any other that are available. If you look, the lock moldings, when I say lock moldings, is the area of the wood that surround the lock are very small, very thin and rounded. It's a characteristic of these guns, and many people miss that. Their locks are very carefully made. Parts are made with CNC equipment, which does make a difference in consistency, quality, how they function. Again, kind of to summarize, this kit that we're offering is a gun that would have been very prevalent in colonial America, the colonies, or early America. And it was a big part of the culture here, frontier culture. And it's nice to be able to offer a kit that's very high quality kit that's representative of those guns. And I think it'll add to our offerings and what people have to use today. So if you have any questions, just let us know.
Thank you.
You're welcome.